Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to NSA Breakfast Club. It is good to be back after a break of a few months where we've been busy with organising Sheep 2022 and plenty of other activities as well. But it's good to be back again for this September Breakfast Club. Once again, we're really grateful for the support of Roythorn's solicitors who are sponsoring this whole series of Breakfast Club webinars. It's really helpful, so thanks very much, Roythorns. And on to today's subject. The title of today's webinar is Reducing the Risk When Buying in Breeding Stock and Ensuring that your investments are wise investments. And here we are at the early September, when people are starting to think about bringing new breeding stock in. Some have already been active in that area already and will have done so already, but we're just about to approach the height of the season, I guess, where people are starting to bring new sheep into the farm, both rams and ewes. And it's I guess we've been through a long period now. We've had some really strong sheep prices, and although lamb prices have dipped away a little bit at the moment, all the indications to date are that breeding stock are still, the prices of breeding stock are still strong. So people are going to be making big investments and spending a serious amount of money, significant money, bringing new stock. And it's really important, I think, that we make sure that those investments are wise investments, that we understand. We have some assurance about the quality of the genetics that we're bringing onto farm. But we also make sure that we're bringing on stock that are from a healthy sources. And we're taking utmost care, I guess, in terms of introducing those stock onto the farm to make sure that both they and the existing flock, I guess, are protected in terms of health and disease. Increasingly, I guess, with the political situation we face with the decline of the basic payment and the change of the whole farm subsidy structure, it's going to be increasingly important that people are making the right decisions economically, and we take steps to try and protect all of our investments. So today we've got three really experienced and good speakers. Sam Boone from Signet, who is well known to a lot of you. Sam is going to be talking about EBVs, the principal EBVs, and again giving us that understanding of genetic potential that we're buying in. We've got Janet Roden from Innovis. Janet, again, will be known to many people, and Janet is involved with a breeding company that is trying to put a lot of what we're talking about today in practice. And then we've got Harriet Fuller, a specialist sheep vet, who's going to be talking last within this group about health status, disease, and protecting the health of the flock. So if I can ask all of our presenters to keep their cameras live, just mute your mics, and just bring your mics open again when you speak. Each speaker is going to talk for some in a region of 15 minutes, and that should give us a good 15 minutes or more for questions and discussion towards the end. And that's enough from me at the moment, I think. So let's just move on, and I'll Sam, we'll pass over to you. Sam Boone from Signet. So the floor is yours, Sam.
Thank you, Phil. Let's do a share screen.
Okay, that's up.
Lovely, thank you very much. Great to have the opportunity to chat to you. I'm Sam from Signet, heading up the genetic evaluation services as part of AHDB. And this is just very much a taste of some of the genetic information that's out there when you're heading off for ram buying. I know lots of you have heard me speak before, but there have been some really big changes to our evaluations in the last 5 or so years. In fact, some of them quite recent. The big one is that we've moved to multi-breed evaluations. We just have 3 now, whereas in the past we had an individual one for Meatlink and Welsh Mountains and Charolais and Blue-faced Leicesters. Now we have them combined into mixed breed analyses, one for terminal sires, one for our maternal breeds, and one for our hill breeds. And the beauty of that is that they run every month. So you're only ever 30 or so days away from a brand new set of breeding values. The other advantage is that we've managed to release some new traits as part of that for all of those breeds involved, not just the numerically large ones. And we can also include crossbred and commercial data, in particular dragging or pulling data through from our Ram Compare progeny test. So some quite big changes, but the principles remain exactly the same. So we head to the ram sale, and you pick the biggest, most beautiful looking ram that's there, and you might have found the one with the best genetics for growth and carcass conformation. It's more likely that you found somebody there that can present rams fantastically. You found a big early born single, possibly that's had quite a large amount of feed, and that's the challenge. You want to be able to tease out the genetic influences of that ram, because that's the only thing he's going to be passing from one generation to the next. And yet what you see is a mixture of both the genetics from mum and dad, but also the environmental influences, the age, the sex, the feeding, the rear type of that ram. So my job's very simple. It's to use statistics to pull those two things apart. And once we've teased out the genetic element, then we talk about those as estimated breeding values. So those are numeric figures that are predictors of genetic merit for specific traits. And Janet will talk a little bit later about how those EBVs are pulled into breeding indexes. So that's what we do. Obviously, your breeding objectives vary depending on whether, on a number of factors, but one is whether we're looking for a terminal sire. So that's in many ways is much easier. We're looking at growth rate, we're looking at carcass attributes, but we also probably need to think a little bit about ease of birth. We're starting to introduce breeding values for things like ease of lambing and birth weight, and particularly if you were looking for rams to mate to ewe lambs, you'd be looking more closely at that. So those are the main attributes when selecting for a terminal sire. When it comes to a maternal ram, well, it then gets even more complicated because we need to think about those attributes, but we also need to think about prolificacy, number of lambs successfully born and reared, milk production, the size of that ewe. We're doing a lot of work on ewe mature size because that influences her efficiency, longevity, and indeed there are a couple of breeds that are doing some really good work on worm resistance at the moment, and that's something to bear in mind. But every farm is different, your breeding objectives are different, and you'll be choosing traits according to your priorities. And I did threaten a meeting in Ludlow yesterday with describing all of our 50 EBVs one by one if they weren't going to concentrate, and that certainly got their attention. So I've talked about the overriding attributes that we have, but these are the individual EBVs that you have to select from. You can see there's a massive range. When I started with Signet, we had 7. And now we've got just under 50. In terms of carcass attributes, we can use the ultrasound scanner, we can use the CT scanner, and indeed we can use RAM compare data to give us abattoir data in our evaluations. So there are lots of bits of information there that you can use. But really, we should be keeping it simple. The big 6 breeding values are often presented on this chart. This happens to be a Suffolk from my meeting yesterday. And you can see here breeding values for 8-week weight. They're units of real units of measurement. So this animal has the breeding potential to be 3.7 kilos heavier than a ram with an EBV of 0. And he'll pass half of those genes on to his progeny. So I would predict that half of that weight advantage would be conferred to his progeny compared to a ram with an EBV of 0. Litter size and maternal ability are telling me about prolificacy of daughters and milk production and maternal care of daughters. I won't see them in the first generation, but I will see them in the second generation as those daughters are retained. And then scan weight tells me about growth, muscle depth and fat depth will tell me about carcass attributes. So some really good, simple figures there that tell me where this ram sits, and the chart tells me where he sits in the breed. So anything off miles to the right is tending to mean more of that particular attribute. If the chart is a long way off to the left, then he's going to be below average for the current year. And the line along the middle isn't 0, it's the current year. So you can see where he sits. And at the bottom, we have a terminal sire index, which is our way of ranking terminal sires, taking growth and carcass attributes into account. And at the bottom, we have a maternal index. So if I was keeping back female replacements, if I was a pedigree Suffolk breeder or breeding Suffolk mules, then that's going to take into account milking ability and prolificacy at the same time. So that's the information I hope you see when you head off to Kelso and Bilth, or you're buying on farm and chatting to folk. And it does work. And the differences between the high performance flocks, those that are using ultrasound and CT, are getting greater each year as they're pulling away from the rest of the population. These are 3 of our demonstration farms up in Yorkshire, Northumberland and Hampshire. This is part of the Ram Compare project. So here I buy the rams from about a dozen different terminal sire breeds. Using AI and natural service, we then mate them to a uniform group of ewes, getting big progeny groups, and collect the data, and then work that back to see how that relates to the genetic merit of the sires that we're using. And here we can see up at Hutt's farm, we've got heavier carcass weights, a lot of lambs already in spec, but we've still got a small improvement there and a benefit of £3 a lamb. Up with Duncan in this particular year in Northumberland, we had heavier carcass weights, we've got an extra value of lambs, but you also had those best lines were away nearly a fortnight earlier, and that was worth a lot of money to Duncan. And for those of you that are lacking grass out there, you don't need me to tell you how important speed of finishing is. And then down at Chawton Park, we actually got both an increase in carcass weights and lamb value of about £5 a lamb, and actually lambs away several weeks earlier on that particular finishing system. So your priorities will vary depending on farm, whether you're selling live or dead, and when you're lambing will have a bit of an influence on your preference for growth and carcass attributes, but it will all make a difference. The beauty of our data is it's all in the public domain. So just head to the Signet website, you put in the ear tag of the animal of interest, you can put in UK tag with the right number of spaces, and you can have a look at your stock rams at home to see where they sit, and you can pull up breeding information. And we actually have data sharing agreements with the Suffolk and the Hampshire and soon the Charolais Breed Society. So actually all of the historic animals are in there. So you can even pull up figures for shearling rams or older stock rams from the database. So lots of information there. And if you can't find them, you can always drop Signet an email to see if they're about. So there are web pages up there to help you find your nearest breeder. There's a page that's showing sheep currently for sale, and there are search tools if you want to find the top Dorset or Charolais or Suffolk for a particular attribute, you can find them. Information via Signet. You can also find information from the Texel website. They run their own evaluations these days in combination with the National Terminal Sire Evaluation. And Innovis, of course, have a lot of information and a lot of sales going on at the moment with the information in the catalogues. Facebook seems to be the go-to place for everything these days, so have a look on there as well. So lots of information out there. My sort of concluding slide really is I've given you a flavour of what information is out there. What sort of things should you be thinking of? And the key message from my meeting yesterday actually was, don't be afraid to challenge your ram breeder. If you've got questions, ask. If there's information that isn't there, ask. It is their job to engage in that discussion. And I think some of us are sometimes a bit nervous about asking for this information if we can't see it. Maybe we're not confident using it ourselves, but that is their job. So the first thing is, does the animal have the right genetic attributes to the flock, and has that animal been measured? It's one thing to buy on muscle depth. You need to make sure he's been measured for muscle depth too. Where does the animal sit within the breed? Where does the animal sit within the flock? So your charts will help you, your benchmarks will help you. I guess just remember that top 10% means different things for different breeds. In a very, very big breed, top 10% actually encompasses a vast, vast number of animals. In a smaller breed, then it's a smaller subset. Is the flock making genetic progress? Are they as interested in genetics as you are? Are they actually buying high index recorded breeding stock themselves? Are they buying in CT scan breeding stock themselves? And they should be able to show you charts and to demonstrate it. And each year you go back, they should be saying, well, we've actually got more of those animals with indexes of 200 that you're interested in, for example. And then there are some really important, I've talked all about genetics because that's my world, but there are some really important questions there about how the animal has been reared, because that's going to influence his longevity on your farm. And there's the discussion to be had there. And then, yes, I will tee it up for our veterinary friends, because it's very much about the health and fertility. If you buy an infertile ram, that's a disaster for the ram, and that is a problem. If he brings in something that takes out the entire flock due to health, then that's an absolute disaster. But Harriet will tell you how to stop that happening. So I think those are my main points, Phil. Hopefully I kept to time.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Sam. You have kept the time, and that was a great start as well. And you know, so much of that is about you know, buying from a known entity, isn't it? Really knowing or having some assurance in terms of the genetics and the genetic potential that you're buying in. So a great starting point. So thanks very much. We're going to do all presentations and then questions afterwards. So I'm sure there'll be a few to you in a while, Sam. So let's pass on now to Janet. Janet Roden from Innovis, who again will be known to many people. So Janet, you can start sharing. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Janet. I oversee the breeding programs at Innovis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you use that sort of information, that EBV information that Sam's talked about, to help guide those wise decisions from an Innovis point of view, but really this applies to anyone that you're buying from. So really, I think there's a number of things that you need to do before you go out to that sale or go onto farm to buy a ram. And I think the first thing you'll always need to do is set your priorities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Choosing your breeder is very important, probably more important than choosing your ram. So choose your breeder first, then your ram within the breeder. And then using those EBVs that Sam has talked about and which we use at Innovis, and principles are very similar, to help make a short list of rams. Then look at the sheep. I don't need to tell you that, that's an obvious one, but EBVs are a tool which you have to use alongside your other judgments about the sheep. A point that I'm often making to people is to try and lose focus on the individual ram, but think about your whole team, your whole flock. Focusing on an individual ram can be a very expensive exercise, so think about the team. And also keep in touch with your breeder, give your breeder feedback. So I'm going to just run through some of those points in a little bit more detail. So first of all, setting your priorities, all about writing a shopping list. We all know what happens when we go food shopping without a shopping list. We come home with a random selection of items that whoever is making meals for the week struggles to do something creative with. Making a shopping list is the efficient way of doing it. Exactly the same when you're buying a ram. Think about what you want this ram to do for you. So compared to your current flock, would you like the lambs, or if it's a maternal ram, the daughters of the ram you buy to do what? Do you want them to rear more or less lambs, and so on? So think very carefully about what it is in your flock that you want that ram to do, and have those prioritized in terms of your shopping list before you go out there spending your money. And think about it completely, you know, think about use size, whether you want carcasses to hit spec, or whether you're hitting it at the moment or whatever. Then choose your breeder. That's really, really important, probably the most important part of your decision, I would say. So every breeder's breeding sheep that will suit their system and the market that they're aiming for, and those will be different. And unless you know that, you can't make a wise decision. So ask lots of questions, chat. We all love going to a sale and having a good chat. It's a great time to catch up with people, but keep some of that chat for talking to the breeders, the sellers. Find out what sort of system they're running. And Sam talked about how the rams have been reared. That will give you a good idea of that. Ask questions about that. Think about what market they're aiming at with their breeding stock. Who are they want? What are they trying to achieve with their breeding stock? Are they aiming at a show market? Are they aiming at deadweight sellers? Are they aiming at outside door lambers? Whatever. Find out what they have in their mind as their market where they're selling their rams, because that's what they'll be breeding them to meet the needs of. Again, Sam talked about checking that they've got good genetic trends. Ask them, what improvements have they made in the flock? What do they still want to make? How's that going? And very importantly, and again, Harriet will pick this up, ask them about the health status of the flock. That might seem cheeky, it might seem rude, but we've got to get into the habit of doing that and being more open about health status. So ask them about it. Ask them about health treatments that the rams have had, what vaccination program they're on. So you know what you've got to pick up and carry on when you take home. So choosing your breeder is really, really important. Then EBVs come in. They're a tool, they're a very, very useful tool to help you make a short list of rams. And as Sam said, basically what EBVs allow you to do is they allow you to compare rams or the genetics of rams on a level playing field. They tell you how you can expect the progeny of those rams to perform. So we have rams, what we see is a mixture of their genetics, which is quantified or estimated by the estimated breeding values or EBVs. But what we see is also influenced by environment and management. So when we want, what we're effectively buying with a ram is something that's going to carry genetics into our flock and spread genetics through our flock. So those EBVs are really, really important for identifying the rams that are going to leave the best progeny for you. So use them as a tool. The other tool you have, which is derived from your EBVs, is an index, an overall index. And Sam showed you the maternal index and the terminal index on the example for the Bentley ram. And there'll be a number of indexes, some breed specific. So just as Signet do at Innovis, we have indexes to rank the overall performance of our rams. So what these do is they combine the EBVs for all the important traits into one overall score. The more important traits will have more influence on the index value. And it's usually a mixture of common sense and economics that's used to derive how much importance each trait should have in that index. At Innovis, all our indexes are developed to very much meet the needs of the commercial producer, and other indexes will be produced in other ways, but there'll be an end point in the derivation of that index to make that overall score. So the index gives you a combination of all the EBVs. So you're faced with a whole heap of figures in terms of the EBVs when you go to a sale. So example of an Innovis catalogue here, but equally Sam's showing you how you can get those figures for any Signet recorded rams. How do you use those figures? So, well, remember, they're tools that are helping you. So the first thing I would do is to look at the index. That gives you an idea of the overall performance. So it gives you a ranking. So the higher the index, the higher the overall ranking of that ram in terms of overall performance. So the higher the, if you like, the economic returns, will think their daughters or their progeny will leave you. So the index is the first place to look at. But then beyond the index, look at those individual EBVs for the individual traits that you've prioritized in your shopping list, and keep your eye on your shopping list. So if you know you need to increase your scanning and lambing percentage, then for example, you were buying an Aberfield ram, you would look at that lambing percentage EBV to target the level that you wanted to achieve. So first rank on the index, then look at the individual traits. And a high index will be achieved by the combination of those traits. So you might find that there's a trait that's not particularly important to you, that's at quite a low value, then that's not a problem, and so on. So use those EBVs to help you shortlist animals. Once you've got your short list of animals, that's when your judgment comes in terms of looking at your animal, and there'll be a number of things that you want to look at and that you want to achieve through doing that, whether it's mouth, fleece, type, whatever. In many sales, so for example, in all the NSA sales and in all the Innovis sales, rams will have been checked beforehand to check that they're sound in terms of testicles, mouths, etc. But that's no reason why you shouldn't look at it yourself. People have different opinions about these things. So, you know, always check that yourself as well. But buying from those sorts of sales does give you some reassurance that those things will have been checked for you. And I said, remember, it's all about the team when you're buying rams. The perfect sheep probably doesn't exist. I certainly haven't met him yet, if he does. And so what we've got to think about the genes that we're bringing into the flock, and the ram is a member of the team that's bringing genes into your flock. So what you need to concentrate on is moving your flock forwards. The best you can do is to bring genes into the flock that keep you heading in the right direction. And you think about that mix of genes that you're bringing in all the time. So different rams will bring different attributes and different genes into the flock. And think about the long game, particularly if you're buying maternal rams. What you're constantly trying to do is just get better genes into that gene pool of your flock. And an investment in a maternal ram is a long-term investment. You're going to see the effects of that ram within your flock, hopefully for 5 to 10 years, if not more. So it's really important in thinking about that and thinking about how the rams will fit together as a team. And finally, keep in touch with your breeder. A long-term relationship with your breeder is good for you and the breeder. And certainly in Innovis, we have many long-term customers who come to us year in year, and if they can't actually come and choose a ram, they're quite happy for us to choose one for them because we have that long-term relationship, and that's a healthy situation to be in. So keep in regular contact with your breeder, let them know how the rams have get on, establish a way within your flock to measure progress and a kind of time frame over what you want to achieve things, so you can check that those rams are delivering the genes and the genetics, the progress that you want to see, and feedback information to the breeder, because that will help them breed better sheep for your flock. So think about those 6 points: setting your priorities, choosing your breeder, using EBVs as a tool to help you make a shortlist and keep your focus on that shopping list. Still look at the sheep, think about health, focus on the team, and give the breeder feedback. And I think that's a good point to probably hand over.
Great. Thanks, Janet.
Harriet.
Thank you. That was excellent, and a great checklist there for anyone looking at bringing sheep onto their farm. So thanks. There's a lot of really good practical advice and guidance there. So can I just remind people to keep posting questions, any questions or comments, keep them coming through, and we'll address them towards the end. And now we're going to move on to that subject of health. And again, this is I mean, both Sam and Janet have mentioned the importance of health status. And you know, one of the reasons that I was keen to do a webinar on this subject, I guess, was because last spring I was contacted by a number of our members who were really disappointed about the investment that they've made the previous September. As I said earlier on, you know, we're just approaching a time now when there's going to be a lot of people buying a lot of breeding sheep. And I remember being contacted back in the spring by 3 different members who had bought ewe lambs last September to run on. And they'd faded away during the autumn and the winter, and they'd gone through veterinary diagnosis, and they'd found to have these were OPA actually in all these 3 cases, and they were all the advice was to slaughter them and to start again. I think those farmers were they'd gone about things in a really good way. Maybe they were lucky that they didn't introduce those ewe lambs to the rest of their flocks, so maybe the risk of spreading disease was minimized. But they were devastated, those 3 farmers, and they felt. And they all said, actually, what is the NSA going to do about this? This was one of the reasons why we've laid on this webinar. And of course, there are things that we can do about it, but this has got to be a shared responsibility. And actually, there are things that the breeders should be doing about it. And there are definitely steps that people buying sheep should be taking to avoid that sort of catastrophe as well. So really keen to step up our efforts in trying to make sure that we're stopping spreading diseases and parasites around our flock on a national basis. So on that introduction, really, I'd like to introduce Harriet Fuller, who's going to give us a bit of an oversight of what we can do to protect our sheep in that health arena. Harriet, the floor is yours. In fact, I think Emma's going to do your slides for you, isn't she? So
yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Phil, and good morning, everyone. Yes, and hopefully this will run smoothly. We've had a bit of a tech issue, so yes, Emma's going to be moving the slides forward for me. So as Phil says, I'm going to talk to you about reducing the risks of bringing in disease, and specifically, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Emma. Hidden diseases that might not show up certainly at the time or for quite some time until after you've had those sheep. So there's obviously considerations you want to make in terms of worms, liver fluke, sheep scab, cod, but we're not going to address those. It's these hidden diseases. You'll see we've got the list here, and the first 3, or maybe the first 5, will be considered often as the iceberg diseases. So diseases where often what you see is only the tip of the iceberg, and there'll be a lot more infected sheep that aren't yet showing signs of disease. But I've also included enzootic abortion, because that's another one that it's very easy to bring in with sheep obviously showing no signs until they start to abort. So we'll move through each of these diseases now, and I just want to explain to you a little bit about the testing that's available and really the pitfalls where you can't find infection, and how easy it is to bring these things in. So I don't think you need to worry too much about the detail. It's more the sort of overview of the difficulties, really. So we'll start with border disease, and one of the reasons I wanted to start with that is because it's perhaps the most simple, in that well, I think actually COVID in a way, and the testing, that's helped everyone sort of understand that you can test for the virus itself or the antibody. And border disease, if you look at the top line of the sheep here, so the sheep on the left, the one with no colour on it, is an unaffected sheep that's then exposed to border disease. It then becomes positive for the virus, it's carrying the virus. And then if we move on, it gets rid of the virus and creates antibody, shown by the green line around it. And with border disease, there are good tests. There's a PCR test which can detect if an animal is infected with the virus, and there's also a good test for detecting antibody. But if we look at the second line now, so we're starting then with a ewe that is in lamb, in say early gestation. If she meets the infection, the virus goes into the lamb as well as in her. The ewe herself makes antibody, but if the fetus is still at quite an early stage, before its immune system is competent, the fetus doesn't make antibody, and it actually stays positive for the virus and never gets rid of it. So the virus becomes almost part of that sheep, and it will never make antibody. It's one of these ones we call persistently infected. It will remain infected throughout its life and continue to shed virus throughout its life. And these are the ones that are the problem in spreading infection within the flock and to other flocks. And I just highlighted there, that's the problem sheep there to identify. You could test that ewe that's carrying an infected lamb, test her for virus, and she will test negative because she's created antibody and got rid of the virus. But her lamb is carrying the virus, and there's no way you can detect that until the lamb is born, and then you could test the lamb. But if you're bringing in lamb ewes, that's a big danger that they might be carrying a border disease persistently infected lamb. So moving on now to Mydevisna. Once again, we've got an uninfected sheep on the left. It's exposed to MV virus and becomes infected, but currently there is no test that can detect Mydevisna virus itself in the sheep. The only test we have is one for antibody, but it could take up to 6 months between the sheep becoming infected and developing antibody. So you see that sheep in the middle is the one that you could bring that in, it's carrying the virus, but there's no way that you can pick that up. I mean, in some cases it might only be a month, say, before they develop antibody, but like I say, it can be 6 months or even more. And an interesting thing with Mydevisna is that the virus gets incorporated into the sort of genetic makeup of the sheep, so they never ever get rid of the virus. Once they're infected, they're always infected with MV virus. Moving on now to Johne's disease. This is a little bit more complex maybe. So we've got our uninfected sheep on the left. If they then meet Johne's disease, which is a bacterial infection, the bacteria go through the gut and might come out in the feces, or probably will come out in the feces at that stage. And then two things can happen. Some sheep will get rid of the bacteria and remain free. They could potentially get infected again later in life, but they probably won't. Or the bacteria gets into the body and they will remain infected then. But at that stage, when they're first sort of properly infected, the bacteria sort of becomes latent in the body and you can't detect it. They're usually not shedding, so you can't pick it up. And then it could be months or years later when they'll start to shed the bacteria again, and then they progress to showing signs of disease. So our sheep right on the right, the one with the green, is probably gone thin now, it's probably shedding, and it's got antibody. But when the infection first becomes sort of latent, that's when they could be carrying infection, but you can't pick it up. And even the next stage, even when they're shedding, the bacteria maybe only shed intermittently. So you could test those two sheep and just not be able to show that they're carrying infection. And there's a slight problem if we go back a stage to the one where it's just passaging through the gut. You might test that animal by doing the PCR test on the feces and it comes up positive, but it may not actually end up being persistently infected with the Johne's disease. It might get rid of it. So you might sort of be over-diagnosing. You're confirming there's infection there, but you're not confirming that that animal is probably going to suffer from Johne's disease. The latest sort of data on Johne's is that infection, a study has suggested that it's present on 50% of flocks, but that doesn't mean 50% of flocks actually have Johne's disease. Infection and disease aren't necessarily the same thing, but the more stress you put sheep under, the more likely that infection is likely to result in disease. Moving on to OPA, same thing again, we've got our uninfected sheep on the left. It becomes infected with OPA virus, and there is currently no test for the virus. Now there is a test that's being developed, PCR test, but it isn't at the stage where it's sufficiently reliable in picking up animals that are going to go on and show disease, nor is it commercially available. So as things stand at the moment, you can't detect when sheep are just infected with OPA. You can only pick it up when that OPA is causing disease. So OPA causes tumours in the lungs. And so once sheep progress to having disease, ultrasound scanning can be used to detect the tumours in the lungs when they're bigger than 1 to 2 centimetres in diameter. At that point, the sheep's probably not showing any signs, but as the tumours spread and increase, that sheep will be showing respiratory distress, probably exercise intolerance, and ultimately will die. But an interesting thing with OPA as well is that there is no detectable antibody response. So there are no lab tests at all to detect animals with OPA. And it probably, well, it is the hardest disease really to be sure. And, you know, Phil was saying earlier about these farmers having OPA and culling the whole flock and then starting again. The problem is it's very hard then to be sure that the flock you're buying from is free from OPA, to be really confident that you're not going to bring it all back in again. Moving on then to, yes, sorry. So well, we've been through that, I think. So we'll move on now to casus lymphadenitis, which is a disease that causes abscesses in the lymph nodes. Same thing, uninfected sheep on the left. It picks up the infection, and at that point, the infection gets into the white blood cells in the animal and is undetectable. There is no test that we can show that that animal is infected, but not yet, hasn't yet developed antibody or shown signs of disease. But with CLA, they do develop antibody, but it can be up to a few months after they're infected. So you've got this window again, where they're infected, no antibody, we can't find them. But there is a detectable antibody response, and in a later stage, they might develop these abscesses, which are typically in the lymph nodes at the angle of the jaw, in front of the shoulder, and behind the back leg sometimes. Those abscesses, if you culture from them, you can isolate the bacteria. So there are tests, it's just in that early stage, that you can't detect the animal that's carrying the infection but not showing signs of disease or has antibody. Next, moving on then to enzootic abortion. Top line, uninfected ewe becomes infected. You can't pick it up then. And the infection is latent. It's a bit like Johne's or CLA really. The infection hides away in the body. When the ewe is in lamb, the infection gets into the lamb, and that ewe that's been infected early will probably go on to abort. She'll develop antibody after she's aborted, so you can detect it by looking for antibody after she's aborted. You can also detect the agent in the aborted lamb with his feet up, and she will also be shedding the agent. So it's a bit like CLA. We can detect the chlamydia that causes the abortion, but we can't detect it when it's latent infection in the ewe. So on the bottom slide, when the ew's already in lamb, she can pick the infection up again then. Now, if she's infected quite late on, she might actually produce a live lamb. It might be weakly lamb, it might be okay actually. And that can also be latently infected, and then that might go on to abort. So there's several points here really on this one where you just can't pick up that the animal's carrying infection. So before it's in lamb, when it's in lamb but hasn't aborted, when it's infected in lamb there, and also the lamb itself that's born alive but infected, you can't detect that infection either. Okay, moving on then to look at the things we can do to minimize the risk of bringing in disease. I think one of the first most obvious things really is to buy in as few sheep as possible, because as you've seen, there are no tests that can pick up all these things. So however much you want to spend or do, it's almost impossible to totally sort of guarantee you couldn't bring something in. And I think as important as just the number of sheep is the number of source flocks. So it always worries me when people say buy a bunch of yearling ewes, and they've obviously been bought as ewe lambs from different flocks, and there might be, 8 or 10 different flock numbers within that bunch of yearlings, because you could have bought something from each different flock. So that's as few source flocks as possible. And as Janet was saying, you really try to develop a relationship with flocks that are reliable in terms of their health status, and keep buying from them rather than keep risking buying from different flocks all the time. And I mentioned about Johne's infection being in the latest study, that it's perhaps in 50% of flocks. MV, I think, is also very worrying in that used to be a very rare infection. Now, a recent study is suggesting it's in 8 to 9% of commercial flocks. So that's 1 in 12 flocks. That's pretty high percentage-wise. So if possible, you want to buy from flocks that are in disease accreditation or monitoring schemes, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But that isn't easy. There aren't accreditation and monitoring schemes for all diseases. For instance, there isn't one for OPA because of the difficulty in testing for it. So it just isn't an option. But where you can, obviously MV, there's an accreditation scheme, buy from flocks that are testing. And as Janet said earlier, you want to be asking questions. They can seem difficult questions, and I think we also have to recognise you're not always going to get the most honest answer. If you ask them, have they seen Johne's, have they seen OPA in their flocks? But the more we talk about it, the more it becomes something that breeders are going to, or vendors are realising they're going to have to be looking at. And I think another thing to be aware of is, just because someone hasn't seen that disease doesn't mean they haven't got it. You've got to look for these things to find them. If you look, you'll find, but if you don't look, you won't find and you won't know. So you want people to be post-morteming ewes that die for no reason, or ewes that fade away and die, so they're really getting some information on what they've got in their flocks. A little bit more on the, if you could, next slide please, Emma. Sorry, I forgot that, didn't I? We'll come back to that. The other thing obviously too is consider post-purchase testing, which we'll come back to on that. So The advantage of buying from flocks or in a health scheme, which, as I've said, isn't that easy, because although there's quite a lot of people in the MV monitoring accreditation scheme, there aren't many flocks in the enzootic abortion scheme or the yoni scheme. There's only those 3 diseases that have accreditation schemes. Monitoring schemes, they're also for border disease, MV and yonis. But if they're in a scheme, that means those flocks will be doing regular monitoring. And if they've been doing it over a period of time, say they've been in the scheme for a few years, it's much greater assurance that disease isn't present than if they've just done a snapshot testing. As we said, snapshot testing, you can easily miss things that are carrying latent infections but haven't yet become detectable by any testing. And the other advantage is that if people are in a scheme, they're following the rules of the scheme on biosecurity, so it's much more reliable. And say their last test was 6 months ago, you know their biosecurity should mean that in that 6 months disease hasn't come in. Next slide, please. So if someone's not in a scheme and they're just doing pre-sale testing, so they might have a bunch of yearlings, say, and they're all tested for MV, there's a risk of false negatives because the infection isn't detectable. So there might be sheep there that are in the phase where they've got infection but they haven't got antibody, so there's things like that. But there's also a risk of false positives. And I think everyone's aware with COVID testing that certainly with the lateral flow, you know, the test kits that we were using, they don't always give the correct result. And there is no test that will be 100% accurate in diagnosing every case of disease and correctly diagnosing things that don't have disease. And the risk of false positives is greater when screening a healthy population. So I've got a couple of slides just to show that. So see on the on this slide, don't worry at all about the detail on this, but you'll see on the left, on the left axis is the frequency of those results. So this is showing some results for an ELISA test. So you've got peaks at one end and the other. So negative and positive, they're quite easy to see, but you've got all these results in the middle where animals are testing at intermediate levels between being negative or being positive. And then the question with those is, which way are they? Because you'll have some animals that don't have disease but actually have a slightly higher result, but some animals that do, that maybe only have a low positive result. And you have to decide where to put the cutoff as to what becomes positive. And depending where you put the cutoff, you might get more false negatives or more false positives. So the cutoff is set according to what people think the rough prevalence of the disease is within that population. Next slide, please. And if you've got a population like this, where you've got a reasonable percentage of animals that the black ones are carrying infection, it's much less likely that if you get one of these intermediate results, it's probably, you know, more likely, or low positive, it's more likely really to be a positive. And actually it matters less if it was a false positive, because you know you've got the disease anyway. But on the next slide, if you've got a healthy population and you test them all, you still may get some of these slightly intermediate results that might be classified as a positive, but actually they're not really a positive. But you don't know that, because it could just be that within that group of sheep, there's one that's only recently become infected, so it's tested low positive and it has really got the disease, or it could be a false positive. So you really need to retest. And if you're testing these animals prior to sale, you may not have time to retest. So you could think, okay, I'll pull out that false positive one and not sell that, and I'll sell all the rest. But can you say they're negative? You can't be 100% sure they're negative, because it might be the disease was just coming in. So it's much more challenging just to do single snapshot testing, and as I said, much more reliable if flocks are in a scheme, regularly testing, and then yes, the false positives become much less of an issue. So post-purchase testing is something I encourage all my clients to do this. So and my choice of test is perhaps based really on things that are positive and things that we've got good reliable tests for. So border disease is one. You can test for, if you've got a group of sheep that have all been running together, you could test some of them for antibody, because if there's a PI amongst them, some will probably be positive for antibody, or you can test them all for virus. And both those tests are relatively cheap, so it's an affordable thing to do. You can test for Mardi Bisner, and that's one of my main reasons for testing for MV, is if you get it in a flock, it's extremely difficult to get rid of. So you just really, really don't want it. And you could have it in your flock for quite a long time before you're really sure you've got it. By the time you're sure, it's in 60 to 70% of the animals there. So you could either test when they come in, or if you can keep them isolated, wait and test them, wait until maybe 6-12 months down the line. Then if you've got any thinner ones, target those to test rather than test all the healthy ones. If you want to test for Johne's or CLA antibody, you need to know if they're vaccinated. Otherwise, you can be testing them. They come back positive for antibody, you're jumping up and down. Then actually, it turns out the reason they're positive for antibody was because the flock you bought them from was vaccinated. So that comes back to asking questions of the vendor again. Point 4, I think, is really important. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do this necessarily with rams, but rams are slightly less of a risk because you're only buying in a small number of them. But with your ewes, if you're buying in ewes, keep them separate from the rest of the flock for as long as possible, up till after lambing, and ideally not until maybe after weaning the next year. And then if anything turns up, you can isolate it to that group and sort that out rather than having to test your whole flock. So if you can do that, I think that makes a massive difference. And constantly be monitoring for signs of disease, ill thrift, abortions, and investigate straight away. Don't wait. The longer you wait, the more things are spread, the less chance you will have of actually getting rid of it. And last slide, I've just put some links to the schemes that are available. So as I said earlier, the only one that's really missing from there is OPA. We don't yet have a scheme because we don't have lab tests that are able to detect infection or antibody. So it's a very difficult one to test for other than your scanning. Sorry, I probably ran over a bit, but
that's all right.
Cool.
Excellent. Thanks, Harriet. There was some very in-depth, but also some very practical advice and guidance there too. So thank you very much. We've got a few questions that are coming up, but I just wanted to, well, ask a question to all of you, really. And you know, you've all given some really good, sound, best practice advice. But one or two of you also mentioned the level of traditional sort of activity that goes on in our industry, I guess, where people love to go to markets, they love to go to sales. And it's such an important part of our industry too. Can we have both? Can we actually maintain that level of traditionality, I guess, and still apply all of the best practice that you've all talked about? I think we can, but come on, let's because I'm an optimist. But Sam,
I'm sure we can retain both. I think what's interesting is there will also be some new exciting things that come along that help retain the interactive bidding and getting together process without maybe some of the health risks and some of the challenges in the presentation of stock. So I'm thinking of online sales that are being developed. I'm thinking of helmsman type auctions that are taking place on farms. I'm thinking of farms that are saying, I won't necessarily go to a multi-vendor sale, but I will have an auction and I will get everybody in and I will give them all, you know, a good beef roll and a drink while they're here. And so retaining some of that social function, some of that looking at sheep and engaging in the process and all that excitement, but taking out some of the challenges. But yeah, there certainly is a role for the multi-vendor events, but I think things will change over time. And I think to an extent, commercial producers will drive some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And Janet, I guess you operate a slightly different, you know, model, don't you, in this area anyway? So, what would your view on that be?
Well, in many ways, I very much agree with Sam, and I agree. I think we've always recognised that getting together as a sale is actually has an important social function as well as trading of sheep. And from a point of view of genetics, I think, you know, as long as it's making information available for people to use as tools in informing their decisions is the key point. Health is more of a challenge, but and I think that's something that we as an industry have to all work our way around. But a lot of that is being more open. And as Harriet says, you know, many surveys are showing that 50% of flocks have Johne's infection within the flocks. And yet, if you ask 20 sheep farmers, do you have Johne's within their flocks? I can virtually guarantee most of them will say no. The odds are 10 of them are wrong. So it's being open and understanding those things helps us maintain that important social tradition in some ways.
Absolutely. And Harry, have you got any comments you'd like to make on that? I guess it's one of the most challenging areas, isn't it? Really is about protecting health when we're bringing groups of sheep together from different sources.
Yeah, it is. It's a massive challenge. And like I said, my particular thing, I think, is this: when you're buying from lots of different flocks, it's a real thing I would sort of try and encourage people not to do, just to be buying from a small number of flocks and to develop that relationship, and also maybe to be aware, just going back to the whole Johne's thing and the 50% of flocks, that if you find you have bought in one of these things, it isn't necessarily a disaster if you do something about it. You know, there is an effective Johne's vaccine, so it isn't always, these things can be managed, but you need to look to find what's there to sort it out.
And that poses another question in my mind. I'll come to the questions that have been pasted on the Q&A in a moment, but it poses another question in my mind around the fact that there's still a lot of reticence within our industry to test and screen and monitor. And of course, it requires an investment. You know, there's a cost. But I think most people would say that cost will repay itself. You know, it's a wise investment to test and screen and manage the process rather than simply take a risk and think I'm not going to spend any money. I mean, you must have loads of examples where you've seen that be the case, that investment in screening and monitoring pays dividends over time.
Absolutely, and I think, well, I don't think, I know, the testing has become cheaper in recent years. For instance, the border disease virus testing has become a lot cheaper because you can test animals in pools of 10. And perhaps I just think we still need to spread awareness of what you can do and how much it's going to cost, that people perhaps perceive it to be more costly than it necessarily is. And there's a lot of advice out there, even if your vet maybe doesn't do a lot with sheep and maybe doesn't have the experience. The vets who work in the labs will always be extremely helpful and help advise the vet on how many you need to test and what tests you need to do. And generally, I think it's more economical than people think, and it's certainly economical compared with the cost of having disease and doing nothing. Definitely, no question, it stacks up as a cost benefit for most things, but you do need to understand what you're doing, really.
And hopefully in time, you know, when the animal health and welfare pathway comes into being in England, and there's similar initiatives being discussed and planned in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, you know, again, maybe that will signify a little bit of a turning point in that vet-farmer relationship and attitudes towards identifying disease and parasites. Let's keep our fingers crossed anyway. I certainly hope that is the case. So there's a couple of questions that I'd like that have come in online as well. One, I think specifically well, in fact, it's not specifically for you, Sam. I think it's probably one for Sam and Janet. Is there a link between the Innovis Index and the Signet Index to make an informed decision? Can the purchaser of rams compare between the two?
I know. I said I'd answer it, so if I could get in front of her, that was why I offered to answer. Let's see if we say the same thing. I think there's two elements there. One is about index construction and weighting and using the information, and then there's another one about comparing sheep. So I thought it might be quite nice for me to acknowledge and also thank Janet, because she's very closely involved in our index construction. The Signet Index that you look at for the Hill Ram scheme was developed by Janet as part of the HCC funded Welsh Hill Ram scheme. She did a lot of work for us on terminal sire carcass traits when we moved to a weight adjusted basis, and certainly did an informal sense check as we developed those indexes. So we actually work very closely together in terms of index construction, and I'll be amazed if she goes away and does something completely different when she creates the Innovis ones. In terms of comparison of sheep, I mean, yes, we run multi-breed evaluations now for hill sheep, but I wouldn't rush out and say to you, look, we can compare Welsh Mountain with Scottish Blackface, because there isn't massive linkage between those populations. They go into the same run. We do a great job of ranking Welsh Mountains, do a great job of ranking Scottish Blackface, but there isn't the direct comparison, even though they're in the same evaluation. And I think I would probably say that when it comes to Innovis maternal strains and some of the maternal strains that record through Cygnet, it's the same scenario. There isn't the direct comparison. And so you're always thinking, right, which are the best sheep within that particular breed, and taking it from there. And I'm sure there'll be quite a bit of overlap and variation, but it's about homing in on the breed and finding the best genetics there. Probably the slight exception, and she may or may not thank me for saying this, but the Aber Blacks that we record, which is a Suffolk composite strain, are looked after by people that are recording Suffolks with us. So where you're chatting to those breeders, they've got information and they can tell you quite a bit about how the pure Suffolks compared to the Aber Black strain. And there's a dialogue to be had there. That's one of the sort of flock projects that we do share.
Right.
Janet? Janet, let's see.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sam. So yeah, very much so. I think in terms of indexes, the principles are very much the same. And as Sam said, I have a finger in both pies. So, you know, the thinking is the same. You know, there will be slight differences in that Sam is running a system that has to meet the needs of a lot of customers. At Innovis, I can concentrate very much on our commercial RAM buyers as my end point, but it's subtle differences. So in terms of that, there's very little difference. And the systems that go in behind calculating in the EBVs are very, very similar. In terms of direct comparison of animals, as Sam said, even within the Cygnet system, breeds can't be directly compared. So you can't compare an Abermax index to a Charolais index, but neither can you compare a Suffolk index to a Charolais index. I think I'd be correct in saying, Sam.
In most cases, yeah.
So in that way, yeah, no, they're not directly comparable. Sam raised the interesting point of our Aber Black breeders, who a proportion of our Aber Black population is also recorded through Cygnet. And so I'm put to the test at this time of year every year, where if my evaluations don't match up with the Cygnet evaluations roughly, I'm told about it. And generally animals do rank in a very similar way, not exactly, because we'd be doing exactly the same thing if we were, but in a very similar way in the two systems. And also our Cheviot population, our hill breeding program, are also recorded both through Cygnet and through our Innovis system. And again, we compare rankings within that, and they are similar. And for those Cheviot animals, any of the North Country type Cheviots, North Country hill type Cheviots that you buy from Innovis, pop their UK number into Sam's Cygnet, and you will see their Cygnet figures for those.
Great.
Yeah, actually, Janet raises an interesting point that I was forgetting, which is she's absolutely right. I have to create an index that caters for everybody. And I have some breeding groups where a small proportion use CT scanning and lots don't. So while in my head I might love to have a very CT focused breeding index, because I have flocks that aren't using that technology, we have a little bit more of a compromise. And the same would be true in some of our maternal breeding programs. If everyone was breeding for worm resistance, then it would be much easier to incorporate it into the index. As it is, we've got a subset that are very dedicated to it, but not everyone. So we create a little sub-index for them so that they can make progress in that trait. And that is an important difference between a breeding company and then providing breeding indexes that are trying to cater for people doing vastly different things. There are ways around that, because we have some customized index software, and indeed some of my breeders recognize that that's the index, but I'm going to move faster for these traits because I'm investing in the phenotypes. So yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks both for that. So the next question we got is from Stephen Perrins. And this might be targeted more towards the NSA, but I'm going to neatly deflect it towards Harriet, actually. And we regularly talk to the drug companies or the pharmaceutical companies about package sizes. But Stephen says Scotts recommends using the 5SI wormer as the gold standard. It would appear that the only product falling into this category is Startex Drench. I purchased a 5 litre bottle to treat my incoming ram last year. I did treat 3 other sheep, but the total amount I used was only 78 mil. What a waste of medicine and a waste of money. Now, there are other ways of going about that problem, aren't there, Harriet? So what would you say to that?
Well, it's a difficult question, actually, because Startex, which is the product name for the only group 5SI wormer, is only available in last year and this year in 5 litre packs. So it's difficult, you know, even for vet practice. If you've only got people buying it to treat a few rams they want to quarantine treat, you're not going to get through 5 litres. And last year it came in really short dated as well. So you ordered it in August, September, and its expiry date was the end of October. So Zoetis is who make the product. It's coming in from New Zealand or Australia at the moment. There isn't any UK made product or UK licensed product. So I'm afraid there isn't a solution. It really perhaps has to go back to the manufacturing companies, but they would argue they didn't sell enough in the first year. And I've been putting pressure on them even just to produce some 1 litre bottles with all the proper labels on, because you put a sticky label on and then it gets wet outside and then all the information comes off. So that's not a good way to dispense it. But it's really difficult when all the vets can buy are 5 litre packs and the data on them isn't always very good either. And everyone knows it's very expensive. So it's very challenging. So the other option is people are using a group 4, use Zolvix as a quarantine drench.
Yeah. Okay, so again, another key message there really is to work closely with the vet to see whether, you know, rather than waste a volume of medicine like that, whether there's other solutions that you could employ, I guess. And yeah, and
most
Steve,
will dispense a small quantity, but having to buy 5 litres to dispense a small quantity, why people don't want to do it.
And you said it's got a relatively short shelf life as well, so the period over which you can dispense it is reduced.
It does vary. It's always a short shelf life, but certainly the stuff we were getting in last year was bad.
Okay, thanks for that. It's coming up to 9:40, so we're going to close in a minute, but I just thought I'd finish by asking you all a question really about whether you know, from the people that you work with and what you see, whether you think that the uptake of a lot of what we've been talking about is on the increase, and you know, how optimistic you are for the future about you know, a lot of this advice and guidance moving forward and really making a you know, a significant change to the industry. So let me start with Sam.
What interests me is that it varies dramatically with breed. So I was working with a wool shedding breed that was being sold exclusively on EBVs. 30% were being sold online at a sale, you know, not quite sight unseen, but via a webcam, something I would have only dreamed of 20 years ago. And that's growing, and that is very, very figures driven. At the other extreme, I've got a couple of terminal sire breeds that I work with, and actually the amount of figures in sale catalogues is less than it would have been 10 years ago. I know lots of those sheep are being sold from farms, so it's about different sale practices. But then it's very hard when I head to the sales banging the drum about genetics and breeding values when that information isn't actually available. So it looks like they're going backwards faster probably than they actually are. You know, that information is available, but through different routes. So I think about it long and hard, and I come to the conclusion that actually a blanket answer isn't useful. The different breeds are going at different speeds.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Thanks. Okay, Janet.
Yeah, I think that's interesting from Sam. I think I probably see a fairly biased group of sheep farmers in dealing with Innovis customers, because they tend to be motivated to use that sort of information. But I think there is a wider uptake and acceptance of using certainly EBVs and indexes as a tool in selecting breeding stock that is growing. But I do accept what Sam says, and certainly have observed it in some sectors, that there's almost kind of becoming a polarization within the industry of not. In terms of health, I'm really greatly encouraged in terms of increase in understanding and openness about managing disease in your flock, and people doing that and being more conscious of it. So I think we're at the start of a journey, but I'm very optimistic that that's something that we'll see big progress on in the next 10 years.
Great, thanks, Janet. That's really encouraging. And Harriet, would you back up what Janet's just said?
I would definitely, actually, and for several reasons, really. One is, as I've already sort of mentioned, the cost of the testing. So maybe 10 years ago, if I'd picked up border disease in a commercial flock, we'd probably decide it wasn't worth, the cost benefit wasn't enough to justify the cost of testing the whole flock to try and get rid of it. And two things have changed that, actually. One is the cost of the testing has come down considerably. And the second, actually, is EID makes it massively easier. Instead of having to sample every animal and write their ear number down, you can scan them and be sure you've got every one, and it's just so much easier. So I think, yes, there's more scope and more people are prepared to do that sort of thing. I think the monitoring schemes that are relatively recently brought in by SRUC and Axiom still haven't perhaps had enough publicity, but if we can get the word out a bit more about those, and maybe the animal health welfare pathway will help with those. Although they're not as robust as an accreditation scheme, they do help to give some sort of indication of disease status and assurance to buyers. So I would agree with Janet. I think we perhaps haven't seen a real change yet, but I feel like it could be coming.
Great. Well, there's a lot of optimism for us, isn't there, really? That's a great message to hear. And, you know, as I said at the outset, you know, people are just approaching the season where they're spending really serious money on bringing breeding stock in. And it's just increasingly important to make sure that, you know, we know what we're bringing in, and well, in terms of genetic potential, but also in terms of disease risks as well. So I'm really pleased that we've covered this subject today. And I'd like to thank you all very much for taking part and contributing. I'd also like to go back again and thank Roy Thorns for their generous support of these Breakfast Club webinars. And our next webinar is going to be on the 2nd of November, I think. And the subject, as we approach the next round of COP negotiations, the theme of the next one will be something around, again, sustainability and the relationship between sheep farming and climate change and nature recovery and those sorts of things. So I'm sure we've you know, we've got a bit more work to do on that one, but I'm sure we'll line up a really interesting session for people. So yeah, it just remains for me to thank you once again, and thank all the participants, all the attendees for joining us this morning. This whole recording will be available on the NSA website